The Tower of Babel, a sleep story. The night settles around us like an old friend, bringing with it the weight of the day and the promise of rest. In these quiet hours, when the world slows its relentless pace and our minds finally have space to wander, we often find ourselves drawn to ancient stories. Tales that have survived millennia, not because they are simple, but because they are endlessly complex, holding within them truths that shift and deepen with each telling. Tonight, let us return to one such story, one that speaks to the eternal human condition, our ambition and our limitations, our desire to reach toward something greater than ourselves, and the inevitable humbling that follows. It is a story about building and breaking, about unity and division, about the space between earth and heaven, where all human dreams take flight. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the world as it once was. In the time after the Great Flood, when the earth was still tender and healing, when the memory of water and destruction lived in every family's stories, there was a people who spoke with one voice. Not metaphorically, literally. Every word that fell from every lip carried the same cadence, the same meaning, the same perfect understanding. When a mother called to her child, every parent within earshot felt the pull of recognition. When a craftsman requested a tool, every hand knew instinctively which implement to provide. This was both blessing and curse, though they did not yet know it. The people had wandered far from the mountains where their ancestors' ark had come to rest, moving eastward with the patient persistence of water seeking its level. They carried with them the stories of the deluge, how the world had been remade, how they had been chosen to continue, how precious and precarious life truly was. But as years passed and children grew and had children of their own, the sharp edge of that terror began to dull. Memory, even collective memory, has a way of softening catastrophe into legend, legend into myth, myth into something comforting rather than cautionary. They came at last to a great plain in the land of Shinar, a vast expanse of fertile earth that stretched toward every horizon like a promise. Here they decided they would stop their wandering. Here they would build not just homes, but something permanent, something that would stand as testament to their survival and their determination never to be scattered again. "Come," said Nimrod, who had emerged as their leader not through conquest, but through the sheer force of his vision. "Let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." This may seem a small thing to modern ears, accustomed as we are to technologies that would have seemed like magic to these ancient people. But in that moment, the discovery of brick-making was revolutionary. No longer would they be dependent on the scattered stones of the earth, limited by what nature provided. They could manufacture their own building materials, create uniformity from clay and fire, impose their will upon the very matter of creation. The kilns burned day and night, their flames licking toward the sky like prayers. The smell of fired clay mingled with the sweat of honest labor, and something beautiful began to take shape. Not just the bricks themselves, but the community that formed around their making. Old men taught young apprentices the precise temperature needed for the strongest brick. Women developed new techniques for gathering and preparing the clay. Children who were too small for the heavy work became messengers, runners, carriers of water and news. For the first time since the flood, they felt truly secure. But security, once tasted, has a way of breeding ambition. "See how we work as one," Nimrod observed one evening, surveying their efforts by the light of the kilns. See how our hands move in harmony, how our voices join in perfect understanding. We are no longer at the mercy of the earth's whims. We have learned to shape the world to our will." The others nodded, feeling the truth of his words. They had indeed transcended their circumstances in ways their flood-surviving ancestors could never have imagined. Where once they had been refugees, scattered and desperate, they were now builders, creators, shapers of their own destiny. "Come then," Nimrod continued, his voice carrying the cadence of prophecy. "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The words hung in the air like smoke from the kilns, and in that hanging moment, the entire trajectory of human history shifted. For embedded in Nimrod's grand vision were two desires that would echo through every civilization that would ever rise: the desire for permanence and the desire for significance. They would build something so magnificent, so enduring, that it would make their names immortal. They would create a monument not just to their survival, but to their transcendence of the very forces that had once nearly destroyed them. But there was something else in Nimrod's words, something his listeners did not immediately recognize: fear. Lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Even in their moment of greatest confidence, even as they planned their assault on heaven itself, they were driven by the terror of separation, of losing the unity that had become their identity. The tower began as a foundation, massive, carefully laid, each brick placed with ceremonial precision. But as it grew, brick by brick, course by course, something began to change in the builders themselves. The higher they climbed, the more they could see of the world spread out below them. From ground level, their plane had seemed like the entire world. From the height of even a few dozen courses, they could see the curvature of the earth, the distant mountains, other rivers, other plains where other peoples might dwell. "Look," said one of the builders, pausing in his work to gesture toward the horizon. "There are other lands out there, other possibilities." "Yes," agreed his companion, not quite understanding the significance of what he was witnessing. "How small they look from here." And there it was, the first crack in their unity, invisible but real. For seeing the world from above had introduced something new into their consciousness: perspective. And with perspective came the beginning of doubt, of questioning, of individual thought that existed apart from the collective voice. But they continued building. The tower grew with remarkable speed, a testament to their organized efficiency and shared purpose. Each day brought new innovations in construction, new techniques for moving materials to greater heights, new solutions to engineering problems their ancestors could never have conceived. They developed a sophisticated system of ramps and pulleys. They created specialized tools for working at dangerous heights. They established a complex hierarchy of supervisors, craftsmen, and laborers that allowed them to coordinate the efforts of thousands. And as the tower grew taller, their pride grew with it. "See how we have surpassed all who came before us," they told each other as they worked. "Our ancestors lived in tents and caves, at the mercy of weather and wild beasts. But we have conquered the very air itself." Visitors from distant lands began to arrive, drawn by stories of the great construction project. They came as traders, as pilgrims, as curiosity seekers, and each brought with them new words, new ways of expressing familiar concepts, new perspectives on old truths. The builders welcomed them, proud to display their achievement, eager to share the glory of their accomplishment. But the visitors brought more than admiration. They brought difference. "In our land," said a trader from the north, "we have a different word for height. To us, it means not just physical elevation, but spiritual aspiration. Your tower, it reaches toward our word for the dwelling place of gods." The builders found this fascinating. They had never considered that their simple word for height might carry such rich connotations. They began to experiment with this new usage, to explore the implications of building not just physically upward, but spiritually as well. "And in our valley," offered a traveler from the east, "when we speak of unity, we mean something more than mere cooperation. We mean the dissolution of individual will into collective purpose. Is this what you have achieved here?" Again, the builders found themselves reconsidering concepts they had always taken for granted. Their unity, was it the simple harmony they had always assumed, or something deeper and more complex? As the seasons passed and the tower continued to rise, these small seeds of linguistic difference began to take root and grow. The builders found themselves using new words, exploring new concepts, developing new ways of understanding their world and their work. What had once been perfectly unified communication began to fracture into dialects, then into distinct vocabularies, then into fundamentally different ways of processing reality itself. But still, they continued building. The tower now reached so high that its peak was often lost in clouds. Workers at the top required a full day to climb from the ground, and many chose to live in temporary shelters built into the structure itself rather than make the daily journey. These high dwellers developed their own culture, their own concerns, their own ways of speaking about problems that were meaningless to those who worked closer to earth. "Send up more mortar," a voice would call from the heights. "What?" would come the reply from below. "We cannot hear you clearly." "Mortar," the call would come again, "the binding substance for the bricks." "Ah," the ground worker would respond, "you mean the mud mix. But we call that joining paste now. The trader from the western mountains taught us a better word." Joining paste? But mortar is the traditional term. It is what we have always called it. Traditional for whom? The Westerners have been building with stone for generations longer than we have been making bricks. Their word carries the wisdom of experience. And so another thread in the fabric of their unity began to fray. At the very pinnacle of the tower, a small group of the most skilled craftsmen worked on what they had begun to call the crown, the final section that would, they believed, actually touch the dwelling place of the divine. These men had been working at such heights for so long that they had developed their own private language, a technical vocabulary so specialized that even their fellow builders could barely understand them. The celestial binding requires more tensile reinforcement, one might say. Agreed. The ethereal load-bearing calculations suggest we need additional vertical stabilization before we attempt the final transcendence modules. To anyone listening from below, this would have sounded like nonsense. But to the men at the top, it represented the cutting edge of human knowledge, the very language of triumph over the natural order. The irony was lost on them. In their effort to reach toward heaven, they had made themselves incomprehensible to their own people. But it was not just language that was fracturing. As the tower grew and the builders organized themselves into increasingly specialized groups, fundamental disagreements began to emerge about the purpose and meaning of their great work. Some, led by Nimrod himself, remained focused on the original vision: to build a monument that would make their name immortal and ensure they would never be scattered. To them, the tower was about permanence, about creating something so magnificent that it would stand forever as a testament to human achievement. Others, influenced by the conversations with foreign visitors, had begun to see the tower in spiritual terms. They believed they were building a pathway to the divine, a means of ascending to heaven, not just physically, but metaphysically. To them, the tower was about transcendence, about breaking free from earthly limitations altogether. Still others, particularly among the younger builders who had grown up with the project, saw it as an end in itself, a demonstration of human capability, a proof that there were no limits to what organized effort could achieve. To them, the tower was about power, about proving that humanity need bow to no authority but its own collective will. And a few, mostly among those who worked at ground level maintaining the foundation, had begun to worry that they had bitten off more than they could chew. They had noticed stress fractures in some of the lower courses, problems with settling and drainage, signs that the massive structure might not be as permanent as its builders assumed. To them, the tower had become a source of anxiety, a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. These different perspectives led to different priorities, different techniques, different standards of workmanship. The careful coordination that had marked the early stages of construction began to break down as various groups pursued their own understanding of what they were trying to achieve. "You're using too much binding paste," a foundation worker might complain to a mid-level builder. "The lower courses can't support that kind of weight distribution." "Binding paste?" the mid-level worker would reply. "You mean transcendental mortar, and the celestial engineers have calculated the load requirements precisely. The foundation concerns are secondary to the spiritual architecture." Spiritual architecture? We're building with bricks and mud, not prayers and wishes. That's exactly the kind of earthbound thinking that limits human potential. And so the arguments would go, with each side speaking past the other, using the same words to mean different things, pursuing the same project toward different ends. The confusion was not helped by the fact that the tower had grown so large that simple communication across its span had become nearly impossible. A message sent from one side of the construction site to the other might pass through a dozen intermediaries, each of whom translated it according to their own understanding and vocabulary. By the time it reached its destination, a simple request for more workers on the north face might have become additional transcendental facilitators required for the alignment of temporal spiritual convergence vectors. But the most subtle and profound change was not in their language or their organization, but in their relationship to each other and to the work itself. The unity that had once characterized their community, that deep, wordless understanding that had allowed them to function as a single organism, had been replaced by something more complex, but also more fragile: cooperation. Where once they had moved together like a murmuration of starlings, each individual perfectly attuned to the whole, they now worked together like a complicated machine, each part performing its function but requiring constant coordination and maintenance to keep the whole apparatus running smoothly. And like any machine, it was subject to breakdown. The breakdown, when it came, was sudden and total. It began on an ordinary morning with an ordinary misunderstanding between two groups of workers. A team working on the tower's spiral ramp needed materials from a group responsible for brick production. The request seemed simple enough. Send up the standard load of building units. But standard load meant different things to different people. To the ramp builders, it meant the usual quantity they received each morning. To the brick makers, it had come to mean the new, larger quantities required for the more complex work being done at higher levels. To the material handlers responsible for moving supplies up the tower, it meant whatever they happened to have available at the moment. The confusion led to delays, which led to frustration, which led to arguments, which led to accusations of incompetence, laziness, and deliberate obstruction. And because the various groups involved were now speaking what amounted to different languages, their attempts to resolve the misunderstanding only made it worse. You failed to deliver the requisite construction matrices, accused the ramp builders. We provided exactly what was specified in the morning allocation protocols, replied the material handlers. The morning protocols were superseded by the new vertical logistics framework, interjected the brick makers. What vertical logistics framework? No one informed us of any framework modifications. The framework was communicated through the standard hierarchical distribution channels. Which channels? We received no such communication. Then your reception protocols must be malfunctioning. Our protocols are perfectly functional. Your transmission methodology is obviously inadequate. And so it went, each group speaking with perfect clarity in their own specialized vocabulary, none of them able to understand or be understood by the others. The argument spread as arguments do. Other work groups, hearing the commotion, came to investigate and found themselves drawn into the conflict. Each tried to help by explaining the situation in their own terms, which only added new layers of confusion and misunderstanding. By midday, work on the entire north face of the tower had ground to a halt, as hundreds of workers stood around arguing about what exactly they were supposed to be doing and who was responsible for the breakdown in communication. By evening, the confusion had spread to other parts of the construction site. Workers who had been laboring in perfect coordination for months suddenly found themselves unable to communicate even the simplest instructions. Hand me that tool, one might say, pointing to a hammer. Which tool? His partner would reply, looking at the same hammer but calling it by a name the first worker no longer recognized. That one. The hitting thing. The hitting thing? Do you mean the impact facilitator or the percussive implement? I mean the thing you hit nails with. Nails? Oh, you mean fastening rods. Why didn't you say so? By the end of the week, the great construction project that had unified thousands of people in common purpose had devolved into chaos. Work groups could no longer coordinate their efforts. Supervisors could no longer communicate instructions. Engineers could no longer share technical information. The specialized vocabulary that each group had developed to describe their part of the work had become so specific, so technical, so removed from common understanding, that it might as well have been a foreign language. And in truth, that's exactly what it had become. But the most profound realization came not from the breakdown in communication, but from what the builders discovered when they tried to step back and understand what had happened to them. Standing at the base of their great tower, looking up at the monument to their ambition, they began to see it with new eyes. The structure that had once seemed like humanity's greatest achievement now looked like something else entirely. A metaphor for the very problem they faced. They had built upward, always upward, reaching toward heaven, but growing further and further away from the earth that had once grounded them. They had specialized, divided their labor, created hierarchies of knowledge and skill that made their work more efficient, but also more fragmented. They had welcomed diversity of thought and technique, which had enriched their understanding, but also undermined their unity. Most tellingly, they had built their tower to prevent themselves from being scattered across the earth. But in the process of building it, they had scattered themselves linguistically, culturally, conceptually. They had achieved physical concentration, but spiritual dispersion. The tower still stood, magnificent and imposing, a testament to human ingenuity and determination. But it was no longer a symbol of unity. It had become a symbol of the impossibility of unity, at least the kind of absolute unity they had once known. Some of the builders, recognizing this, began to see their situation differently. Instead of viewing the breakdown in communication as a failure, they began to understand it as a natural and perhaps even necessary development. The unity they had lost had been, in many ways, a limitation as much as a strength. It had made them powerful, but it had also made them brittle. It had allowed them to work in perfect coordination, but it had also prevented them from thinking independently, from questioning assumptions, from exploring new possibilities. Perhaps, suggested one of the foundation workers who had long worried about the structural integrity of their great project, this is not a catastrophe, but an opportunity. How so? Asked his companion, who had until recently been known by a name they now pronounced differently. We have learned to build in ways our ancestors never imagined. We have developed techniques and technologies that have advanced human knowledge by generations. We have proven that we can organize thousands of people in pursuit of a common goal. These are not small achievements. But we have also lost the ability to work together. We can no longer speak with one voice. True. But perhaps speaking with one voice was never sustainable. Perhaps what we have gained, the ability to think independently, to question, to innovate, to see the world from multiple perspectives, is worth more than what we have lost. This conversation, repeated in various forms throughout the community, marked the beginning of their acceptance of what had happened to them. They began to understand that the breakdown of their grand project was not simply a failure of communication or coordination, but something deeper, the inevitable result of human growth and development. They had begun as a simple people with a simple language and a simple goal, survival. But in pursuing that goal, they had become something more complex, more sophisticated, more capable, and also more diverse, more individualistic, more difficult to unify. The question was, what to do next? The answer, when it came, surprised many of them with its simplicity. Instead of trying to rebuild their lost unity, instead of attempting to restore their single voice and common purpose, they would embrace their new diversity. They would scatter. Not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. Different groups, with their different languages and different perspectives and different skills, would go to different lands. Some would continue to be builders, using what they had learned to create new cities, new monuments, new testaments to human ambition. Others, would become explorers, carrying their knowledge to distant shores and learning from the peoples they encountered there. Still others would become storytellers, preserving the memory of what they had attempted and what they had learned. And some would remain, tending the great tower, not as a symbol of human unity, but as a reminder of human complexity. A monument not to what they had achieved, but to what they had discovered about themselves in the process of trying to achieve it. The departure was not bitter. There were tears, certainly, and regrets about what might have been. But there was also excitement about what might yet be, and gratitude for what had been learned. As the various groups prepared to leave, each taking with them their own understanding of what the tower meant and what their shared experience had taught them, they realized something remarkable. They were not really scattering at all. They were expanding. They were carrying the seeds of their great experiment to new soil, where different conditions might allow different kinds of growth. The tower they left behind would stand for many generations, growing gradually smaller in the distance as they traveled to their new homes, but never disappearing entirely from their memories. And in those memories, it would remain not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder of the complexity and wonder of human ambition. Future generations, seeing the great structure rising from the plain of Shinar, would tell many stories about it. Some would see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and ambition. Others would interpret it as a celebration of human ingenuity and determination. Still others would understand it as an explanation for the diversity of languages and cultures that enriched the world. All of these interpretations would contain elements of truth, because the story of the tower was large enough to contain multiple meanings, just as humanity itself was large enough to contain multiple ways of being human. And so we return to the present moment, to the quiet darkness of this night, to the space between sleeping and waking, where ancient stories reveal their deepest meanings. The Tower of Babel speaks to us across the millennia, not because it offers simple answers, but because it asks enduring questions. What does it mean to be united? What is the relationship between individual growth and collective purpose? How do we balance our desire for permanence with the reality of change? What do we lose when we gain complexity, and what do we gain when we lose simplicity? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps that is the point. The builders of Babel discovered something that every human community must eventually discover: that growth and unity exist in tension with each other, that success often contains the seeds of its own transformation, that our greatest achievements and our greatest challenges are often the same thing viewed from different angles. In our own age, when technology allows us to communicate instantly across the globe, but often leaves us feeling more isolated than ever, when we have access to more information than any previous generation, but struggle to agree on basic facts, when our increased capabilities seem to coincide with increased fragmentation, the story of Babel feels remarkably contemporary. Perhaps the builder's experience suggests that this tension is not a bug in the human system, but a feature. Perhaps the loss of simple unity is the price we pay for the gain of complex possibility. Perhaps what looks like failure from one perspective is evolution from another. The tower still stands in our imaginations, as magnificent and troubling as ever. It reminds us that human ambition is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability, that our desire to transcend our limitations is both inspiring and dangerous. That every attempt to reach toward heaven changes us in ways we cannot predict or control. But it also reminds us that we are builders by nature, that we cannot help but dream of creating something greater than ourselves, that even our failures teach us something valuable about who we are and what we might become. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you the image of those ancient builders, learning to speak in new tongues, preparing to scatter to new lands, looking back at their great tower with a mixture of pride and regret and hope. They had not achieved what they set out to achieve, but they had achieved something else, perhaps something even more valuable. They had learned that being human means being endlessly capable of growth, change, and surprise, even when we think we know exactly what we're trying to accomplish. In the end, the Tower of Babel stands as a monument not to human failure, but to human complexity, a reminder that we are always more than we think we are, always capable of becoming more than we imagined, always building towards something we cannot quite name but somehow recognize when we see it rising against the sky. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to build, to question, to grow, to discover what it means to be human in all its beautiful, complicated, ever-changing glory. The Tower Builder's story continues in each of us, in every word we speak, in every dream we dare to pursue, in every moment when we reach toward something greater than ourselves and discover in the reaching that we have already become more than we were.